Boy, do we have a treat for you today. The playable character of all playable characters, Mr. Bob Burnett, joins us today. Joins us today to impart wisdom that only someone like Bob can give. And this is something that is a little bit missing in the Bitcoin community, is wisdom and experience from people who have been there and done that. And Bob is one of the most intelligent, thoughtful, kind people that I know. And again, a dozen episodes in so far, and I continue to learn things every single episode. And you never cease to be amazed in the Bitcoin space. You get to a point you say, man, I know so much, and then you're just humbled. Always stay humble, stack sats. And I think that's what Bob is the epitome of Bob is humility and his grace and his wisdom. So please enjoy this episode. We went for almost 2 hours. It took a lot of Bob's time, and I'm just so grateful that he was able to share some of his journey, but more importantly, what his thoughts are about the Bitcoin community currently and some potential issues he has with it and how to correct them moving forward. I think this is stuff that you're not going to hear anywhere else. I look forward to you enjoying it, and let us know your questions, comments, concerns on the back end of it. Enjoy. Mr. Bob Burnett, CEO of Barefoot Mining and one of our trusted advisors for Bitcoin trading cards as well, an esteemed position, which we'll talk about a little bit today. And boy, your story is incredible, and I just enjoy talking to you so much, and the pleasure is all mine. Thank you for coming on today, Bob.
Well, thank you. That's very kind of you. I enjoy my time with you as well, and so I'm anxious to do this.
Beautiful. Well, so it's funny. Like I know your story pretty well. I've talked to you a fair amount, and but still, watching some pods with you and doing some of my homework and stuff like that. I was just watching one, in the last day or two with CK, and there's a lot of cool stuff you shared in there. But I don't want to talk about your story too much. You can elaborate on a little bit. Obviously, you come onto these and you talk about your stories a lot. People can kind of just go through those motions. So if you want to hit that quick and just give a brief, basically historical kind of background there, so we can jump into some other things, because I think there's a lot of things to talk about with you. So,
well, sure, thank you. For those of you not watching, I'm an older guy. I've been around a long time. My history in the technology space goes back really probably to about 1979, when I was in high school at the time, and this is pre-IBM PC days, and got a chance to start coding. And I had a great teacher in mathematics then that kind of inspired me, and it led me ultimately to get a degree in engineering, computer science, electrical engineering. And then out of college, I was blessed to go work for a company called Zenith, which older members of the audience will remember as a major TV brand. But they had a personal computer division as well. The IBM PC had been released in 1984. It was kind of took the world by storm, at least the business world at that time. They were very expensive. It was a business computing tool. And Zenith was a maker of what were called the clones at the time, or IBM PC compatible machines. And that was kind of the revolution, by the way. When you look at kind of what happens with kind of Bitcoin, was kind of like Bitcoin Core in a way. The IBM PC was Bitcoin Core. It established. Hey, really quick, I want to annoy the hell out of you with a quick little break to just remind you that we have to share the signal within the noise, because the algorithms hate truth. The algorithm hates truth. So we have to do all that we can to spread the signal. The faster we do that, the quicker change comes to the world. We need to be the change we seek to be. What are we doing? What am I doing? What are you doing to build a future? Also, if you want a written version of a lot of what we do here, please go to the description and find the link to our blog, our Substack, as well as you will see many links to either the work or the companies, the places you can find all the playable characters here that we talk to and how you can connect with them. So now back to the show. Thank you. The baseline upon which everything else afterwards came, and so if you tried to fork off of that at that time, it didn't work. People tried all the time to say, well, I could do something better than the IBM PC. We'll save that, maybe the details of that for another day, but it's really interesting that hard forks have a tendency not to work. That, there were a lot of soft forks, but no hard forks. But I ended up coming out of school just by a stroke of luck, got assigned to a team that was developing what I believe to be the first laptop computer. And so there were mobile kind of devices before then, but they were what we called luggables at the time. Some of them even had like a CRT in them. They were big and heavy. They'd have a big handle. Most of them didn't have batteries, so they could move from point A to point B with some effort, but they weren't like work on the airplane kind of designs. And that design, which we called the clamshell. So if you think about what a notebook looks like, it looks like a clamshell, right? Kind of a way it opens and closes. So that design was what we were kind of innovating around and creating the first true IBM compatible clamshell design laptop. And so that was a great experience. And I spent 6 years there and then left because I had a vision along with some of the other technical and marketing folks within Zenith that the personal computing industry was going to move a certain way, which was toward, in the laptop area, smaller, lighter, more mobile, as opposed to making them cheaper. And that ended up leading to me doing a startup company. That startup company designed what we called a sub-notebook computer, the first sub-notebook computer, which was a 1 kilogram, 2.2 pounds for those US people, machine that would run Windows. That company was successful in that we created the product. We were funded by Mitsui and Sanyo, which are two big Japanese companies. We then we didn't have the money though to like take it to market. We had the money to develop it, which we did. We got to work it working, but we didn't have enough money to create a brand and a sales channel and a customer support team and all that sort of stuff. So we ended up selling that design and ultimately basically the company to Gateway, the personal computer company Gateway, and I joined Gateway. And this was still early in the Gateway history. Gateway was still a private company. It did not have any mobile division at that time. So I came in, started that division, grew that to $1 billion business unit within Gateway. And not just me, but a whole bunch of people. Obviously, it takes a team to do something like that.
Yeah.
And then migrated into a position, ultimately becoming the chief technical officer there. As part of that, I also was part of the team that helped take Gateway public. And so, that experience from 1986, and I left Gateway in 2004, that almost 20-year period was just a whirlwind that it was like, I don't know. I kind of felt like, I was on the great Boston Celtics teams in basketball. Like I had, it was like winning the championship year after year. It was just the ride of a lifetime. And Gateway I ended up having the CEO who is still a friend of mine, actually an investor in some of Barefoot Mining's ventures. His name's Ted Waite. And he had stepped aside, and then I didn't get along with the new CEO. And so I would say I quit. They would say I'm fired. Doesn't really matter, right? But I left in 2004 and started a technology incubator. Did that for about 12 years. Actually, it continued for about 20, but in 2017 is when I got a phone call from an ex-Gateway person who said, Bob, can you design some Ethereum mining equipment for me? I need 300 Ethereum mining servers. And so we Keith Thomas, who's the president at Barefoot Mining, who's also an ex-Gateway person. He was the head of desktop engineering at Gateway. We looked at that request. And make a long story short, it looked like an exciting opportunity. A little piece of history is that in the very early days of Gateway, we were approached by a startup called NVIDIA that no one had ever given any business to. And Keith, especially, he deserves more credit for this than I do. Keith was the head of desktop engineering, and the first company to design NVIDIA silicon into a computer was Gateway. And Keith was part of that. I was part of the team too, but Keith really deserves credit for that. We designed that in there. The Jensen and the whole team at NVIDIA luckily remembered us. So we called them up and said, hey, will you support us getting into this business? They did. And we did that for a while. We had some success with it. In the course of that, what ended up happening was after supplying the products to the first customer, we started asking other people, would you like one of these too? And the answer was yes, usually, but qualified yes, only if you will host it for us. Mm-hmm. So we ended up having to open a hosting business so that we could sell the computers. And to be fair, in that time period, we had a fiat mentality toward it. We were selling computers to make money, and then we started hosting computers to make money. Dollars. Mm-hmm. Like it was a very dollar-based thing. And then we realized how much money there was the clients who were buying the computers were making, though, and we started taking the profits and started self-mining with the profits. We create new systems that we would then mine for ourselves with, all Ethereum based. But then being a technical person and also having some economics education and interest, I started to feel uncomfortable with Ethereum. I started to understand what Bitcoin was about. And the company started to pivot away from Ethereum to Bitcoin. After, I don't know, it took about 2 years, honestly, probably to get to the point where it's like, well, we're not going to do the Ethereum thing anymore. And we continued to host the Ethereum machines from the people that bought it from us until the switch. But we kind of felt dirty doing it a little bit, like, but we had made a commitment to some of these people that we would do it. And so anyway, that's how we got in this business of being involved in Bitcoin and being involved with mining.
Yeah, and one of my first things really was, why should people listen to you? And I asked that, not of people, but I asked that of myself in a way. So setting people up when we come on here and things like that. And I told you Miami when I was talking to you guys. I mean, I love your perspective because there's that thing we talked about Miami, the whole okay boomer thing, and ironically your Twitter handle is boomer_BTC, right? And we have lost all of that in this world, I believe, unfortunately, of learning from people that have the wisdom, had the experience ahead of us. And that's why I know our team, obviously, it feels so grateful to have you or us under your wing, so to speak. And it's just completely lost on society, the things that and the things that people that are 50, 60 and up, 70 and up, 80 and up all know, that a lot of people just don't get nowadays. Boy, oh boy, it's so sad. And that's why I respect you so much. I know our team does. It's incredible. And I wanted to note that your Twitter handle, because it is hilarious. It's a play on that. Your podcast, Old Man Yells podcast, is awesome. So it's you have to, go ahead.
Yeah, no, well, thank you for saying that, first of all. And
of course.
I think you're right. As you get older, you realize that it's one thing to have intellectual horsepower, and Bitcoin has a lot of that, a lot of really smart people. But what you can't buy wisdom, you can't buy experience. You can try to read, you can try to do something, but the reality is it has to be something that you experience. And I think that's what some of us can provide is, we've lived a long time. We've made a lot of mistakes. We've had some successes. And I think that the tendency of the Bitcoin community to discard the boomers or even look at them in an antagonistic way is a mistake. And that's not to say there aren't issues with boomers. And I also understand why some people that are of your generation, let's say, might have some animosity toward boomers because they think that things that happened in that, let's say, era when they were in control, so to say, still are, frankly,
Yep.
caused the world's problems. But I think it's misdirected.
Yeah.
I don't think it's a generational issue. I think it's an issue of people in places like the Fed and in government groups. It has nothing to do with how old they were. It has to do with where they were and their approach. I was in my career, I was trying to make the world a better place. I've always been motivated more by what I was working on than what incentive was around it, at least what monetary incentive was around it. I know you have an athletic background, and I have not at your level, I have some athletic background, but I'll tell you when let's say it was like 1987, and the first time I walked on an airplane and saw somebody I didn't even know pull my laptop out of a bag and open it up and start working on it. Like, that's winning a championship, man. I mean, that's like the coolest thing. And I've now had that experience hundreds, if not thousands of times, seeing things that, I helped work on. That's what motivated me. Like, hey, the world is a little better place. It's got a little bit more efficiency because of something that a team I was working on, did. And I think what you'll find is that most boomers come from a good place, but they don't understand. How you can't. I struggle with this too, and part of the reason I say boomer is I want the younger generations to know I am like, and hopefully I can lend some credibility to my generation, but I also want my generation to look at me as somebody safe. Because what I will say, old people, it's not just my generation. This is, I think older generations have a difficult time looking to younger generations for wisdom. Like,
yeah, always.
I mean, I think probably everybody's guilty of that, right? You're still a young guy.
Yep.
But if some 16-year-old tells you something, you're going to look at it with a certain degree of skepticism. So I think we all have to know that, but that's probably to a certain degree wrong, right? I mean, I think we have to have a certain open mind when we do that. So yeah. So I think the boomer thing is very important, and I think that the one thing about boomers too is if you look at to somebody who's, let's say, 35 and Bitcoin's approaching 15 years old, Bitcoin feels like it's been there forever. For a boomer, 15 years is still a material amount of time, but we have a huge history before it. And I think what that allows us to realize is that we're still very, very young in the way in the Bitcoin maturity and ecosystem. And a lot of things could still happen and will change. One thing that really strikes me from my days in the personal computer industry is that if we go back to, let's pick a year, let's call it 1990. Okay. So if if we did a list of the top companies in the personal computing space from 1990 and compared it to that same list from 2005, you'd see radically different companies involved. Only probably 2 or 3 names that were there in 1990 would still be there in 2005. And even, by the way, even if it was only like the difference between 1990 and let's say 1998, you still had a massive turnover. And so, part of it is that the people and the companies that make up the Bitcoin, what would we say, kind of the core of the Bitcoin world, are probably going to be radically different from today than they are 5 years from now. And so, I caution people from getting too, how can I say, too attached to any company or way of thinking in this space. As an example of that, a year ago today, the largest mining company in the world was Core Scientific. And, December, they filed bankruptcy. December of 2022, they filed bankruptcy. You're going to see a lot more bankruptcies and mergers, and you'll see people come and go. I don't think it's difficult for me to articulate this. I don't think I can state strongly enough like how much change is going to come. And I don't think people are ready for the level of change that is going to come.
And okay, that's you kind of encapsulated like a few of the things I wanted to kind of go into. This is beautiful. And really quick, circling back to I think of Alvin Toffler's book, Future Shock from decades ago, and the ability to learn, unlearn, and relearn. And that's where I think of people like you, of Greg Foss, Larry Lepard, maybe Adam Back. There's a number of people that Bitcoiners, because it is a more youthful, I guess, quote unquote, movement right now. Like you just mentioned, in a few years, it's going to change. It's going to completely change. Different groups of people are coming in, and I think that's where people have to stay nimble. Quite honestly, stay humble, stack sats. Yeah. Right. I mean, it's the ethos. And so I think that's so important for people to recognize that. And this is kind of what I wanted to get into, which is, you mentioned on CK's podcast that you were energized, the same, if not more than you were even 20, 30 years ago when you were in that space, when you were seeing this kind of happen again. And you just alluded to some of it. And why is this so life-changing? Like what kind of change do you think we're going to see? You mentioned even conferences that back in the 90s that were 100,000 people, 200,000 people in Vegas. Do you see that in the future here with Bitcoin in the next 2, 4, 8, 10, the next decade? What does it look like to you?
Here's what I think. I think we will go through a cycle that will have that level of enthusiasm, and then I think it will fade away. That doesn't mean Bitcoin fades away, but if we use, for instance, the personal computer industry as a baseline or something that we can mimic off of, think about what happened. In the early 80s, nobody has a PC, literally nobody. And by the way, what was the PC? The PC was really the first step in the decentralization of information and computing power. So prior to that, if you wanted to get on a computer, you could, but what you had was you had a dumb terminal. So that connected to some sort of centralized computer, and you would request information or request some processing or ask it to run a program for you. It would send you the result. And the personal computer changed that. Boom! It moved the processing and the information to the edge. So if you study networks, you want a centralized network or a decentralized network? Well, the personal computer created that. And then this revolution starts on the backside of it as it became cheaper and more accessible. And by the way, it was hard to use. So think about like things like self-custody, how hard it is, or perception of how hard it is to self-custody something.
Yes.
Well, the barrier for the personal computer in the early days was ease of use. It was very difficult to use. It was hard to get it started, and only a select group of people really had the confidence to. In reality, it wasn't that hard, but it was such a foreign thing that when you threw it in front of somebody who had no experience with it, they would just they get scared of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they were afraid of doing something wrong. They were afraid of deleting a file or like things like that. That's what people were afraid of.
Yes.
Well, that changed. And then we went through in primarily the very late 80s and the 90s, we went through this massive period where the personal computer went from something that maybe only large corporations or businesses could afford because they cost $3,000 or $4,000 and they were somewhat difficult to use. The software was limited. To by the mid 90s, which there was a seminal moment, which would have been 1995, and the release of a product called Windows 95. And by the way, a whole set of computers. Like we designed specific computers. We designed a specific laptop called the Gateway Solo, interestingly, that was launched in partnership with Microsoft the same day as Windows 95. And in fact, I was in Seattle for that. There's this famous video of Bill Gates and Steve Ballmer dancing around on stage. It's like one of these really awkward ones. I was there live.
I think I've seen it. Yeah.
Yeah, I was there live for that. It really was awkward. But what changed was, the internet starts coming in too. But software was starting to change too. And the usability fears went away. And so by the end of the 90s, I would say pretty much in every middle class home in America, and in the Western world for that matter, or any developed nation, every home had one. May not have had one for every household member, but there was a computer in basically every home. And that time period coincided with what I was talking to you about with like these conferences. Everybody was so excited about it. And whether you were in the personal computer industry or you were in a business that was starting to utilize them, you would go to these conferences and just suck up the information. Interestingly, the adoption of the personal computer continued to skyrocket. I think the number is something like 130 million PCs sold per year, something like that, year after year after year after year. But by the middle of the 2000s, those conferences had pretty much evaporated. They'd gotten really small again. Why? Because it had commoditized and people had gotten comfortable with it. So I think that's what Bitcoin wants to do too. I think Bitcoin wants to go from where we are now. We want to ride this wave of excitement, which will last for some period of time. We haven't peaked yet. And then as it becomes ubiquitous and everybody's comfortable with it, there probably won't be Bitcoin conferences at the same level anymore. And that won't mean Bitcoin is doing worse. It will mean it's doing better, ironically.
Yeah, it's so funny you say that. And I have to agree with that. It confirms my own narrative bias, I guess. In the last number of months, I mean, I'll spend a lot of time on Spaces and whatever it is, Cafe Bitcoin, Simply Bitcoin, a lot of stuff. And we joke, and I say a lot, like, we're not gonna you don't have fiat conferences, like we're not going and celebrating the U.S. dollar, right? Like, so enjoy it now, because 15 years from now, we're not gonna have Bitcoin Miami. Like, it's just gonna be different. So you're confirming exactly what I've been thinking for a while now.
Yeah. And, it's interesting too, because there's different, I actually just wrote an article for another publication. I submitted it today to them. And one of the things I did in this article was I contrasted, by the way, Miami to Prague, because I spoke in both places. I attended both of them. And, Bitcoin, I think my guess is a lot of people that are in your audience were at Miami or know somebody that was at Miami or read about Miami, right? And my perception of Miami was, attendance was down 50%. I understand why. We didn't have the euphoria of the bull run to fuel it. The people, but that doesn't mean it was a bad conference again. I think it
was great. Yeah.
Dangerous to, but it wasn't euphoria. It was kind of a down to business thing. Hey, what are the geopolitical implications? We had Robert F. Kennedy Jr. there, and we had, it
was the lunch pail crew. Yeah.
I mean, people were down there and people were working, people were making shit happen. And the discussion was not, well, is the price at the end of the year going to be 80,000 or 40,000? That was not what we were talking about.
No, none of that.
Interestingly, though, so very down to business, but interestingly, in Prague, which was about 6,500 people, by the way, majority of them Central European people, most of them either people from Czech or Slovakia. It was a different theme. In this article I wrote, I gave two examples. The first example, or interaction, maybe is the way to say it, was talking to this guy from Slovakia. And it's an interesting stat. Since the beginning of the Russian conflict, 1 million people have sought refuge in Slovakia from Ukraine. So they share a border, by the way. Slovakia is kind of on the southwest border of Ukraine. 1 million people out of there. So and it's not, I don't know the population of Slovakia, not huge, right? I mean, that's 1 million people coming through. That's a big number. And a lot of stories. And so the people in Slovakia are firsthand looking at the implications of Russia forcing these people out, and all of their property rights, cars that they owned, houses that they owned, stocks that they owned, bank accounts, all those property rights for those Ukrainians were at a minimum in jeopardy. Some of them have lost it all with no recourse. And some of them are at least facing the very real possibility of it. And now the Slovakians are saying, well, if Russia wins this thing, now guess who your neighbor is? Like the thing that separates Slovakia from Russia is Ukraine. Now they're our neighbors. So it's forcing this mindset change into the Slovakians. Like, hey, I have to take this seriously. And even though their country is now relatively stable, it might not be forever. And we'll talk about maybe probabilities and some things like that in a second. It's one of the things I like to talk about. So this guy from Slovakia is sitting there saying, well, I'm at the conference. Why is he at the conference? Like, he wants to learn for very, not for hypothetical reasons, for like real reasons. Like, hey, my future of my family is dependent on me learning things like, how do I custody? How do I have a multi-sig? How do I, very, very practical things. And I think in Miami, there's all these theoretical like discussions and, hey, we have to get people to self-custody. Well, the Slovakian folks, they're showing up at conferences, even fairly new people, to really implement this stuff in a way that they have to. Like, so there's a difference between this kind of theoretical thing that we kind of talk about in the Western developed world from the way people in either developing worlds or unstable regions look at Bitcoin. And what I say at the conclusion of the article basically is that technology even we talked about the PC technology typically has risen through the developing world, the developed world. So in other words, first tier economies are where cell phones first became useful and personal computers became useful, and things like that. But in this case, then if the developing world has a greater need and the barriers to entry are low, cost of entry and the knowledge of entry is low, then the developing world will be where the new technology emerges. And I think that's Bitcoin, by the way. So, I think we have a mistake that we make in the Western world is always to think about Bitcoin through the optics of our first world economy, as effed up as it is, right? But
yes,
it's still, there's this difference between all these these theoretical, what if CBDCs come, or what if social credit scores get tied, and these sort of things, to people who are looking at refugees on their streets, to worry about Russians bombing their countries. If you're a country and you're in China's backyard, that's very different. If you Central African countries, you look at there was one of the CFA countries in the last few days has had some big upheaval. There was a military coup in.
Yeah, I saw the guy on Twitter crying or something like that.
Yeah.
I can't remember now who it was.
I think it was Nigeria.
Nigeria. It was Nigeria.
Yeah, I think they told him. Now my understanding of the story is that he was part of a group leading a transition away from the CFA. And somehow, miraculously, the military overthrew him, and they're putting a kibosh on that. And they accused him of all kinds of misdeeds, which may or may not have occurred. I don't know. And that he had 48 hours to prove his innocence, or they'd shoot him in the head.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's probably off the topic.
All roads lead to Bitcoin, right? I mean, holy cow. Yeah. So I know you mentioned probabilities. We talked about 100 million people, kind of where we are probably at maybe globally with Bitcoin, and where maybe the mid 90s with the PC and just adoption rates and things of that nature. Obviously, we talked about conferences and relationships that you gain from conferences as well. So just, network effects there, obviously digitally, the computer side, and network effects of the human capital, which I think is so huge in the Bitcoin world. Did you want to touch on anything probability wise and dive into that a little further right now? Because
Sure. Go finish your question. I'm sorry.
No, it made me think of like Bhutan mining things. I wanted to talk for a few minutes. Maybe, in a minute we could talk about just some of the mining stuff and just kind of your thoughts on mining, but we can go there in a minute.
Okay. Yeah, I think these will tie together. So, I'm an engineer math guy. So I have a tendency to always be running numbers through my head, and I'm also as an engineer, when you design something, you always have to design it to some level of reliability. And so, as an example, one that I've given before, but let's say I'm designing a laptop computer and I need a battery pack for that laptop computer. Now, if I design that battery pack with, let's say, 99.9% reliability, I think the average person would look at that and say, that sounds pretty good. And by the way, let's say that constitutes an annual failure rate or reliability. Mm-hmm. Well, that means 1 in 1,000 is going to fail. And like back in my gateway days, we would sell 9 million PCs a year. We might sell 2 million mobile computers a year. Well, That's not very good. I mean, that's thousands of batteries failing. And then if some percentage of those fail in a catastrophic fashion, I'm sure everybody's seen the pictures of a Tesla on fire or a cell phone on fire or something like that. Go, well, that's people are going to get hurt. In fact, one of the things I've said could even potentially relate to another topic we'll talk about later is I'll ask you, Brandon. So, do you know the difference between a battery and a bomb?
Stored energy.
Well, you're close. I mean, basically, the only difference between a battery and a bomb is the manner in which the energy gets released, the ability to control the release of the energy. And a battery that can't control the release of its energy is a bomb. So, and it's a lot of energy, even in, for instance, a laptop computer or a cell phone. There's a lot of energy density there. And if not properly controlled, it becomes a bomb. And that was an early lesson that I got working on these things, because the senior the boomers, the guys that were teaching me when I was a young engineer, told me things like that. Like, hey, if you're building the circuitry that manages either the charging of the battery or monitors the discharge or looks for failures, this is what can happen, right? You are making a bomb. So,
wow.
So, and so it's always been a very serious thing for me. So why am I telling you this? Because if you want to build a battery pack, knowing if you're going to sell 1 million of those a year, well, you probably better be designing like 99.9999%, something like that, which we would call 6 nines, by the way, 6 nines of reliability, 99.9999. And I think what we have to do for Bitcoin, the entire ecosystem, we have to design at that level, at 6 nines of reliability. And the first and foremost thing we have to design at that level is the mining network. And I believe, without calling out individuals right now, that day may come, but right now I won't. I think there are people within the mining community that don't take that perspective. They are fiat-oriented people. They look at the threats, external threats, and discard them. They're often people that don't come from an engineering kind of background either. But, they think of this as other people's problems, maybe. They don't think long term. So what I look at is our responsibility. Those of us like me, I exist at the base layer, right? That's part of what I do.
Yes.
And I think, I need to be an advocate for designing that base layer so that we can be money for the next 1,000 years. And so we have to build and design with that mentality. And so when people say, for instance, we talked about how long Bitcoin's been around, 15 years. Nothing in our history, if you're thinking about 1,000-year history, then 15 years is insignificant in 1,000-year history. And so we can't draw any comfort from the fact that nothing bad has happened in 15 years. It's meaningless. And we have to assume, I believe, that what we are doing is disrupting the very power structure of the world. Certainly the economic structure, but I would say even more so, we disrupt the power structure of the world. And we can't assume that those people and organizations that are threatened by what we do will go lightly. And so we have to take things like decentralization of the mining network really, really seriously as an example. And I see us not in danger now, but I see us moving in directions that can lead to that. Not tomorrow, not next year, but 10 years from now or 15 years from now. And I think we have to be cognizant of it, because once we're there and exposed, it's almost impossible to undo it and get back. And if we are exposed, we will go down.
Interesting. What, really quick, I shouldn't say really quick, but what are maybe some of those things that have you concerned long term, and what are some of the things that you are very optimistic about when it comes to mining, obviously, and what's going on there?
Yeah. By the way, I'm not here to be a doomsdayer. Don't get me wrong, because we are
Bob's not a doomsday guy.
Yeah.
You're not a doomsday guy.
We are in a completely preventable situation. I mean, we can completely insulate ourselves from this. And that's why I'm doing it.
Yeah. You're looking far down the road. And I think that needs to be stated here for sure. Like you're thinking way far down the road. What can be done? Yeah.
Yeah. In fact, I'll tell you, there's some content. I've talked about it just a tiny bit. I'll do it here. It's an article or Old Man Yells episode. I have to go into more detail, but there's a concept of the 10th man. Have you ever heard of the 10th man?
In what respect? For the 12th man, 6th man.
Yeah, the 12th man and the 6th man. Well, the 10th man's different. Guy. So the 10th man is a form of devil's advocacy. And there's a great little snippet in the movie World War Z. If you're ever a fan, it's the Brad Pitt zombie movie. Okay. So how does that relate to Bitcoin? Well, in the movie, the zombies are taking over the world. Great movie, by the way. I love it. So zombies are taking over the world, and there's this virus, right? But there's a point in the movie where basically every city in the world has been overrun except for like Jerusalem. And they've got this wall built around Jerusalem, and they've been completely safe, at least to that point in the movie. And so Brad Pitt ends up there, and he's talking to the head of security for Israel and says, well, how did you guys do this? Because, everybody else has been overrun. And he said, well, it's because of the 10th man. And so Brad says, what's the 10th man? Well, the 10th man goes back to the 1972 Munich Olympics. And at the Munich Olympics, apparently, there was some reports coming out that a terrorist attack might be made upon the village and attacking Israeli athletes. And the Security Council in Israel did not take them seriously. They just didn't have enough substance to it, so they ignored it and they put nothing in place. Again, for those of you who are younger, may not know that what ended up happening was there actually was an attack, and kind of one of the darkest moment, probably the darkest moment in Olympic history, was the Israeli athletes being captured and murdered. So Israel said, hey, in our Security Council, there are 10 members. And when a threat presents itself, if the first 9 members evaluating the threat all disregard it, then it is mandatory that the 10th man, regardless of what he thinks about the situation, must make a case as to why it should be taken seriously. Now, the other 9 might still say no, but it's imprudent on the 10th man to be the devil's advocate. Mm-hmm. And so I view part of my role is to be the 10th man. And that I'm saying things that I've already been told by some prominent people in the Bitcoin community that I shouldn't worry about, that these things will never happen. And I still do it because I realize that they're not high probability things. But again, in any one year, in any one small time period of time, they are not high probability. They're very low probability. But when you take a low probability each year and you multiply it times 1,000 years, well, okay, it starts becoming a higher probability.
Yeah.
And so what are the things that I see? Well, I believe in the mining world, we are seeing a strong trend toward elephant sites, what I call elephant sites. So I divide all mining sites into 3 classes: rabbits, horses, and elephants. Elephants are big, powerful monstrosity sites. They're often very impressive. For instance, Riot's got a really great site, the biggest one in the world. The rabbits are the people that have home miners, and they have 1 or 2 or 6 or something like that in a shed in their basement, whatever. God bless the rabbits. And the horses are smaller scale commercial sites that, by the way, my company specializes in, which could be a few hundred kilowatts to a few megawatts. And I use that nomenclature because what I say about the elephants is they are big and powerful, but they're slow to grow and they're easy to hunt. And the rabbits, they individually have no power, but collectively they can actually do some damage, right? If you have a overrun of rabbits, you could do some damage, and you can hunt one of them. But the moment you hunt one of them, they all scatter, and you can't get them. So, and then the horses are in the middle. Like a horse is powerful, but it's also very mobile. It can, if you were hunting wild horses, which would obviously be a terrible thing to do, but if you were hunting wild horses, you could, you might take one off, but they're gonna scatter and they're gonna be all over the place, right? And so what I view is that at the fundamental hardware level, we need a mining infrastructure that is a balanced ecosystem. It's fine for there to be some elephants. It's fine for there to be horses, and there's fine for there to be the rabbits, but we need them all. They all play a different role in the ecosystem, and we can't let anyone get too dominant. And what has happened in the last couple years is we've seen this massive movement toward the elephants. And we can go into this a little more, but if I've written an article for anybody that's really interested in the details of this called Satoshi's Heel. You can search my name or Satoshi's Heel on the Bitcoin Magazine website, and I'll go through the mathematics of this in that. But imagine a world where some point in the future we have 99% of the hash rate that sits in the hands of the elephants, and maybe there's only 100 elephant sites around the world. Well, I won't bore you with the details, but basically a well-timed attack, by the way, which the attack could simply be people showing up with guns and telling the operators of the elephant sites to turn them off. Not 51% attack, by the way. I don't believe that's the attack. I don't think that's the attack vector. I think the attack vector is, again, I won't bore you with the math. If you have 99% of the hash rate all in the elephants, and at the exact moment of a difficulty adjustment, you tell them to turn off, block times go from 10 minutes to 18 hours. And It will take 4 years to get to the point where the difficulty adjustment can start correcting itself, because you have to go 2016 blocks to correct it. So is that avoidable? Absolutely. We just have to not get too dependent on the elephants, because my math says that if just 30% of the hash power sits in the horses and the rabbits and it can't be impaired by an action like that, we'll limp along for a tiny bit of time, but it'll clear quickly and the network rebalances itself, right? But if we go too hard, then that creates a problem. The elephants create other problems, though. just like anything, right? Have you ever seen like where an ecosystem, like a biological ecosystem, if the apex predator just starts to dominate, usually it kind of collapses on itself.
Mm-hmm.
And you know what happened? I mentioned I will call a Core Scientific here, which I've done a little bit publicly, but you know, Core Scientific was part of a huge problem. They're a public company, I would say operating outside the ethos of Bitcoin. They were taking advantage of the Cantillon effect by getting very easy access to capital. They were frivolous with the capital. They bought up all the hash power. They used their power to make it impossible for rabbits and horses to acquire equipment at reasonable prices. For the whole second half of 21 and all of 2022, they ruined it. They put all the rabbits, not all, but a lot of rabbits and horses out of business. Fortunately, my company was able to weather that storm. But we couldn't get access to equipment because they bought it all. And they did it for out of greed. They didn't even have places to plug this equipment in. They were just afraid of somebody else getting it. It's, you know, like classic hoarding. I mean, is
yeah.
You know, and I said this, I think, in the one you mentioned, the discussion with CK. I don't know why the Bitcoin community has given them such a pass. This is bad shit. Like, you know, we vilified FTX and Celsius and Voyager and the executives with it. Why are we giving these guys a free pass? They not only hoarded this equipment, then because they were keeping their Bitcoin in their treasury, which we can talk about that too if you want. When they ran into problems because they had such poor treasury management, the massive price decline that we saw in the second half of 2022 was in large part because they were forced to liquidate all that Bitcoin that was in their treasury. It was at least a major contributing factor, right? There's a lot of things going on.
Yeah.
But it was a major factor in driving the price. And the more that they sold, the more that the price went down, which meant they had to sell more. And their treasury management was so bad. It's why, by the way, like in my company, we do have investors. We work heavily with private investors. But in all of my different companies, Barefoot Mining operates these, and we've got, I don't know what we have now, 8 or 9 other companies that sit beneath that. But we distribute the Bitcoin to the investors. We don't keep it in corporate treasury. We give it to the investors because, well, it's like we always say, right? It's not your keys, not your coin. Well, to our investors, like, don't trust me. But I'm a good guy. I'm not going to screw you. But don't trust me. You know, and get it out. So I don't know why people find appeal in a lot of the publicly traded mining companies that are hoarding this Bitcoin. I mean, it's really no different. People are being very critical of BlackRock and the ETF, and it's not your coins. And I really fail to see the difference between what one of these ETFs would be and buying stock in the mining companies. It's essentially the same thing. So anyway, that's probably way off wherever the hell you wanted to take us.
No, it's amazing stuff. It's just in the stuff that you don't get to hear very often, because there are things that we talk, the Bitcoiners for whatever reason the last few years talk a lot about the macro and interest rates and things like that, and that's just kind of like the cycle we're in right now. The last few years, obviously, that's the inflation and things like that. So that's what gets the talking points. But this is what I think is so interesting, and one of my things, my questions to you in a way was, do you think mining is going to change the world? Like literally change, how we operate. And because the more I learn about mining, it's I just can't see a world where the Bitcoin mining industry just completely changes human civilization. And that's my opinion, but I would love to get your take on that, because I think that this is such an important thing, whether it was getting through this ESG FUD and all this garbage that's going on there, and the people starting to understand the importance of what Bitcoin mining does and what you're doing to do the mining, but also to think about the problems or potential problems, I guess, probably best way, potential issues you could run into down the road with mining. So I think this is so huge to start talking about, but I think we're getting there. I feel like a little bit of a sea change in the Bitcoin community, where people are starting to understand this. You're seeing us get over some of these hurdles with the ESG and things. Like you said, BlackRock coming in a way is a confirmation of them being like, well, maybe it's not so bad. So I'd love to get your take on all that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on. Like, for instance, you mentioned Bhutan earlier. I just saw earlier today that Kazakhstan is announcing that they'll be bringing up some mining to handle. They're very hydro based there, and as they have excess power, they don't want to waste it, and God bless. So I think we're going to see more and more sovereigns jump in. I don't think it would be a revelation to tell people that I expect energy companies to jump in. I expect pretty much anybody in financial services to jump in. That may be one that I think others are not talking about as much. It's probably several hour dialogue. I am going to give a talk on this, by the way, at BitBlock Boom for anybody that's going to be there. But
oh, nice.
The latter piece I'll foreshadow in that I think the world has failed to understand the scarcity of block space. This is the theme of my talk at BitBlock Boom.
Yeah.
And they sniffed it with ordinals. But a lot of people had a hissy fit over what was happening with ordinals. Block space is finite. You could say that it is a second level of absolute scarcity within Bitcoin. If you think about it, like Bitcoin's monetary supply is probably the first absolutely scarce thing, right? And I think we've talked about that as a community and the wonderful ramifications of that. But amazingly, I believe the second case in human history of an absolutely scarce resource is block space. And we essentially can't change 4 megabytes per block, and we can't change 10 minutes, more than a few seconds either way. Right? Unlike anything else, right? If American Express wants to increase its transaction capacity, they can. If the central bank of the U.S. the Fed wants to increase the transaction capacity of the FedWire, they can, or the SWIFT system or whatever. There are ways to engineer that and increase it. We can't change 4 megabytes every 10 minutes. That's it. And that translates to a certain number of transactions. And again, to foreshadow my talk a little bit, well, what is that? It probably is about 4,000 transactions every 10 minutes. That's about 53,000 blocks per year, if you do the math. That means there's a little over 200 million base layer interactions that can occur annually. Well, there's 8 billion people. There's 300 million companies in the world. If we expect a Bitcoin standard, or even a fraction of a Bitcoin standard, then access to that block space will be ungodly face-melting expensive. And it means that things that we in the community probably take for granted, like, hey, I can go move some sats on or off the base layer whenever I want for essentially free. Even during the ordinals thing, it would still be essentially for free.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to happen. Now, so we get to the nation states mining. Try to wrap it back around. I think almost every sovereign country will have either their own mining or some access to a mining operation, because it is only through mining, miners and mining pools, that you can control access to the base layer. By the way, this will be a wild thing. People will freak out about this. I'm probably going to make enemies for this one too, but how much you pay does not guarantee you access to a block. Blocks are chosen by the miners, and they can choose whatever transactions they want to include in a block. So if you're a sovereign nation, if you're Bhutan, you probably want to go out and say, hey, I think I better go control some percentage of the world's hash power, either directly or maybe in cooperation with other countries that I have good relationships with, so that I know that my country can have access to block space. I think what I'm talking about here is I don't think I've heard anybody else talking about very much.
Oh, I've not.
It's but if you extend that, you say, well, Coinbase is going to want to have some access. By the way, Binance already does, but I'm not a big Binance fan, but they control a whole bunch of mining.
Mm-hmm.
And say, well, why is that the case? Well, if you go look at the blocks that Binance mines, what you'll find is the block structure looks very different from the blocks that were either expected to be mined or that are mined by others. Why is that? I can only suppose, but I'm pretty sure I'm right. It's because they're taking their transactions, input at the lowest possible fee, and mining their shit first. And so that allows them to reduce their cost of interacting with the base layer. And it also guarantees them a certain level of access. So, because if they control, let's say through their pools, 5% of the world's hash power, statistically, they can know that they're going to have 7 or 8 blocks per day that they mine.
Mm-hmm.
So, that means every couple hours they can go, whatever they want to do, they can go do, and then with whatever left over, they can add other transactions that are probably motivated by the economics. But if they want to, they can fill the whole block with whatever they want. If they want to do UTXO consolidation within their platform, and it consumes all 4 megabytes, they'll put in that at the lowest fee and mine it, and then all these people that put in the max fee will find they can't get in. So anyway, it's probably not the direction you wanted to go, and we can kind of circle back to maybe some of the more conventional.
No, I know I want to be cognizant of your time. Do you have time to run through another? Okay, cool.
Bit.
Yeah, same. I have some time too. So, so that makes me think of, I'll get your quick thought on this, but it makes me think of, I hate using this term, I guess, or word, but NATO. It makes me think of an alliance with countries where they're like, hey, you're going to mine Bitcoin, we're going to mine, like, make sure we get block spaced. Yeah. Is that something you perceive?
Absolutely. Yeah. That was what I was referring to when you say like with Bhutan. And these countries like Bhutan and Kazakhstan and El Salvador, they're really freaking smart. This is an opportunity for them to put themselves in a position of control. And if you think about it, these are countries that, relative to the traditional establishment global financial system, they have zero power. They are completely at the whim of these other ones. So I think what's happening is, ironically, there's a lot of talk about BRICS. That's an alliance, like you said.
Yeah.
It's a financial version of NATO.
Mm-hmm.
But I think this is more likely to have staying power than BRICS, for instance. And it's not so much. I mean, we'll see what sort of, if I'm not saying there can't be some sort of new currency that's backed by Bitcoin or some other sound money stuff that couldn't emerge and all that. There are probably people more qualified than me to put odds on that. But I definitely see alliances around control of access to block space.
What are your thoughts? And one last one, I guess, maybe in this vein a little bit. Your thoughts on whether it's a Putin or, and I guess it could be Xi, but these kind of commodity-rich countries, obviously, maybe it's the global South, maybe it's Ukraine, Putin, things like that. I mean, it seems so obvious that they're going to start mining a Bitcoin, or at least, at the very least, measuring what they have in Bitcoin. It surprised me it hasn't happened, I guess, in a way, but these are big ships to turn around, I guess, at the same time. And what are your thoughts on maybe how that kind of plays out, and kind of in that world of them denominating commodities, their hard assets in Bitcoin, or getting into that mining space?
They have an interesting dilemma. They may or may not see it. These are all smart people, but the dilemma, I think, is this. If they back Bitcoin in a big way, either a national currency or some sort of aligned currency for trade amongst an aligned group of countries, Bitcoin has this phenomenal appeal because I think it's the only thing that they could ultimately agree on, because it's the only way to prove custody, for instance, of the backed thing. But I think it becomes a bit of a Trojan horse to these countries. We'll take the most extreme example, North Korea. So it's highly likely North Korea is mining today. It's highly likely that they use it for international commerce. Now, if inside North Korea, Bitcoin, so at the sovereign level, it makes phenomenal sense. At the individual level, it becomes this massive threat to everything that they believe in, everything that creates their power structure. So I think we have this situation where, I think we have a tendency in the Western world to try to say there's good guys and bad guys. And, I'm not sure there are any good guys, by the way. I think maybe that's a better way to look at it. I mean,
Bitcoiner answer right there.
The sovereign level. Yeah, I think, so I think what we in the West traditionally call the bad guys or the bad actors, if they go this route, which I think they have to, because we're kicking them out of this global system. Some we already have, like Iran and North Korea, and now a bigger group. Then it becomes a Trojan horse to a certain degree, where as it infiltrates and drifts down into the local people, Bitcoin becomes the Bitcoin freedom sort of thing starts taking place, and their ability to control the people and management starts getting harder and harder and harder. Now, in a place like North Korea, it probably takes a couple decades and probably a couple regime changes to knock that sucker down. But I think it happens. But to a certain degree, that's the same thing as the U.S., right? That's why I said I'm not
Yeah.
sure who the good guys are and who the bad guys are, because I think that's the same threat to the U.S. that the ability to control the money supply is the root of all power. And as they lose control of the currency and the money, they lose control of the power. And so all those sort of things create this ripple effect. That said, I think Bitcoin rises to prominence in the developing world. That El Salvador is a bit of a false flag. Not that it's not a great thing, but I don't think it's going to be sovereign nation adoption in the developing world. It's going to be what we would call the plebs.
Yeah.
My wife's from Lola, my wife's
Yep.
from the Philippines. Well, it's 110 million Filipinos that live in a country that's kind of democratic, but has been just abused for years. And it's starting to get some momentum at the individual level. Little communities, just like Bitcoin Beach, are emerging in places like that. There becomes a point where the government just loses control, and people start rejecting the local currency in favor of Bitcoin. We see it in little pockets. I don't see any way for them to manage it, short of starting to, assassinate people and things like that. And then I think in a place like the Philippines, that will be difficult for them to ever do in a mass level. It's happened at smaller levels, but I think it'll be difficult for it to happen. So anyway, I think the world loses control by the billions of people who are living in the developing world adopting it because it's their only option.
Yeah, I mean, like that's one of the big debates I feel like people have. It's what are we fighting for in a way? I've seen it crop up a lot in the last 6 months or so. But like, what are we in it for? Are we in it for nation state adoption and government telling us, hey, you can use it now, or is it the plebs? Is it the people on the ground saying, no, we are changing things, and you will, you work at the consent of us, the people. And I think that's one of these debates, which, like you said, I mean, the decentralization keeps happening over time, and I think it does eventually come from the people because that's generally how it always has happened, right? So I think you're spot on.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with nation state adoption. I know there are people like Samson who is out advocating for it. I was a small piece of working with the El Salvadorians in the very early days of that transition. I love it. I hope it happens. But I don't think it's the way the world really changes. I think the world really changes because you get people in Central Africa and Southeast Asia and South America and Slovakia and places like that just adopt it. And from my what would be the right term? My amateur pursuits of Austrian economics. I try to stay abreast of it, but I think what the Austrians would say was, governments do not declare money. Money is emergent. And so it will emerge from society just the way that we're talking about here. So it doesn't matter. I would say the US dollar in its current form is probably the only legitimate case of arguably a successfully dictated money. Everything else, and by the way, there's an argument, right, whether it was successful or a abject failure. I don't know, but so
It's interesting. You say it too, because which I've never thought about before, but I just heard it again a couple of months ago. I forget who had said it, but they were talking about the American Revolution, and it was the only time, or maybe at least as far as we know, that the elites were the ones that was top down, saying, "Hey, we're out of here. We're not doing this anymore. We're out of here. We're doing this new thing." And so it kind of, like you said, proves your point in a way. Like it's not very often you have the elites, the people at the top saying, "Hey, this is what we're going to do," and then everyone else just like, "Oh, okay, we're going to adopt that now." And that was maybe the only time that it ever really that this experiment worked, like you said, or quote unquote, or it's working.
Yeah.
So I think it's very interesting. It's usually that bottom up, so it has to be the groundswell. A couple things here before we wrap that I wanted to touch on. Like I love your tweets. I love the Old Man Yells podcast, and so everyone has to go listen to that. We'll link it in here. But some of the tweets, I'm always like reading them. I'll read them to my wife. I'm like, "Oh, Bob, like you got to read the, I got to read you this or something like that." You just have a great way of explaining things very succinctly. And I had a few of them that I pulled up just because I bookmarked them. I feel like I bookmark a lot of your
Thank you.
tweets.
Thank you. I'm honored.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so everyone would do themselves a service by following you, Boomer_BTC, on Twitter, well, X or whatever the heck they call it now,
Yeah.
and following you. So
you.
one of them, yeah, of course, Bob, and one of them was some guy had been talking about distribution. So I was gonna have you just touch on a couple of these things and just your thoughts on them. But some people going to reading these, and I'll again link them in here so people can see them because they're not long, but the distribution of Bitcoin, and someone had said it's not really a truly decentralized money because 90% of it's been issued to a few million people. And you came in with like a paragraph or two and just kind of nicely sliced them and diced them. And at the end, you just put what Bitcoin does fix is that no one can counterfeit their way to wealth. I was gonna have you just kind of touch on that a little bit and in some, I guess, FUD, I guess, if you will, in a way, and kind of addressing that. But you said it so well in some of these tweets I bookmarked.
I'll try to be as eloquent as the tweet. So, you can only earn Bitcoin, whether that's directly or indirectly. So you either mined it or, you mined it through your fiat world and transferred it. And since January 3rd or January 2nd, was it the 3rd? Yeah, January 3rd, sorry.
Yep.
Yeah, January 3rd of 2009. It's been fair and available to everybody. And I believe that without question, certainly probably over the last 5 to 7 years, everybody in the world, I mean, you can go to a poor section of a slum in Southeast Asia and you say Bitcoin, they're going to at least have heard of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, the opportunity has been there. And, I have a little website that I maintain, got to update it, but it's called satsperperson.com. And introduced this concept called the SAT cap and SATCAP. The concept of SAT cap is Satoshis per capita. So if you take all the people in the world and you divide it by all the Bitcoin in the world, what you find is it's about 240,000 Satoshis, which is about $70 right now. You could buy that much for $70. So every person in the world, even a pretty poor person, has a shot with some level of commitment of acquiring their share. And to the degree they don't, it's their own fault. Maybe that's too strong of a word, but it's their own choice. Maybe it's their own choice. And so I don't think it's fair to say that it's not available to everybody, or people will say that it's become centralized or things like that, because it's right there. And you can go get multiple SAT caps. So if for $70 you can get one SAT cap, for 140 bucks you can now own the Bitcoin of 2 people. For $350 you can own the SAT caps of 5 people. And what I like to say is, if you believe that ultimately Bitcoin is the world's money, then one sat cap is the wealth of one person. 10 sat caps, is the wealth of a family. 100 sat caps is the wealth of a village. 1,000 sat caps is the wealth of a town. 10,000 is the wealth of a city. 100,000 maybe is the wealth of a state. So, just to kind of put that in crude context, all that's still, I'm not saying 100,000 is achievable. I'm seriously doubt I will see that. But those levels of wealth are still out there and available. And obviously, I encourage everybody to go get their share.
Yeah, I'll link that that site as well, which I've used that many times, and I think I forgot that you are the one that maintained that actually. So I love it. It's a great little site to just put into perspective, where we truly are, and people not being able to counterfeit wealth. And that's what it's, this wealth inequality thing. And that's what someone was kind of coming at you with, in a way, wealth inequality, and then also the distribution of it. And it's such a brilliant way of explaining it. The other one, the second to last one, was the one that just the other day, I believe, a week or two ago, someone had said, responding to, hey, I've had a problem with a friend that keeps insisting the money supply should increase and be flexible as civilization grows. And in your answer, which I'll read, which is, imagine a massive room with a line down the middle. All the money in the world is on the left side, and all the things, the cars, socks, art, cups, spoons, are on the right. Now freeze it all for a moment. If I go into my backyard and chop down a tree and make a chair and put it on the right side of the room, then the same amount of money represents more things. And as a result, the average price of everything falls by a tiny amount. This is deflation, and everyone wins because all the money increased in purchasing power. On the other hand, if someone adds 10% more money in the left side, without a change in the stuff, the goods or services on the right side, then everything on the right side will be an average of 10% more expensive. This is inflationary, and it is good only for those who got the extra 10%. So I look forward to the video. I know you're going to do a video on that. I look forward to that. But that is one of the, I think, I did a YouTube video based off of this the other day, and talked about you in it, because I truly think this is, if that one thing was taught in school, I don't know a more important thing to talk about than what you just explained right there, and it changes the world basically. So I would love to get your thoughts on just the importance of this.
Obviously, I'm very passionate about it, and like everybody else, probably for a couple of years, I was struggling to answer that same question. It's a hard one.
It is.
So I had to go down to, obviously you read the whole tweet, so I won't repeat it, but tell you why, how did I arrive at this? I think it's an important thing. So and I've been criticized by it, usually by people from MMT and Keynesian world sort of people. And some people would say, well, even then it's too simplistic, or, blah, blah, blah. And this is capital markets and blah, blah, all this bullshit. So what I did, which is a bigger piece, I have such a long list of content I have to finish. And you're aware of some of them.
Yeah.
But one of them was, I said, well, I've heard people, even Bitcoiners, say, well, when we go to Mars and we go out into interstellar space, Bitcoin should be the money. By the way, I disagree. I don't think it works. Talk about that another time. But what it does do is, if you think and you say, well, if I go to some other place and I start constructing a society and an economic system from scratch, it gets a lot easier, honestly, to start thinking about these things, because people get all caught up in CPI and producer price index and GDP growth and, money supply manipulation and fiscal policy and blah, blah, blah. Well, you know what? If you step back and you just do what I did, like you said, okay, we just put 10 people on Mars. They arrived at Mars they each had a backpack, right? With the same shit in it.
Yep.
2 t-shirts, an undershirt. They each have a chair. They each have, whatever. And then you start just kind of building from there, say, okay, well, an economy needs to emerge amongst these people. How does the economy emerge? How does money emerge? How do these things happen? Well, you end up with things like I just described there, which is go, well, basically the money represents the stuff. It's like any accounting system, there's a balance between the two. And so if you do, like I just said, whatever that pile of stuff is, and you freeze it, and you freeze the money, and then just think about, okay, what happens when I add or subtract to either side? And then by the way, what's morally right and wrong, on those actions. And I think the answer is very obvious. And kudos to Jeff Booth's a friend of mine, but he's got a great book, Prices Tomorrow, that's about why markets are naturally deflationary. And so my visualization there is really kind of a very simplified version of what he explains there.
Yeah, Jeff's book is amazing too. So anyone who hasn't read that, it's just one of the best books I've read in the last 5 years by far. So that is a must read. And I think this, like I said, it kind of touched me because this is such an important. I've we've talked about it again. I have 4 little children, and these are things that I'm trying to teach them as well. Like these basic, and as an engineer, obviously, like these basic foundational principles, thermodynamically sound principles, nature's law, things like that, where you're trying to teach them the right way. That way, they're not into these smoke and mirror games that you just alluded to, which is CPI and all this garbage that's made up by the Krugmans of the world or the Ben Bernackes who are getting Nobel Peace Prizes for burning down the economic system.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's they try to create this appearance of some level of knowledge and intellectualism that the average person couldn't possibly understand, right? But the truth of the matter is inflation or deflation is very simple.
Yes.
It really is not. Again, we'll go back to that that visualization that I try to create for people there. That's it. Like,
Yep.
Anything else is just distraction.
Yep. It is, and it's again in the engineering world. I mean, the more complex something is, you just add this difficulty to it when you're not making things simple. When reality it is, many of these things are very simple. Cool. All right. Well, in wrapping, one last one here, a thought on you, and you mentioned it kind of circling before you wrap with a couple of quicker lightning round things. The Ethereum. You had this tweet about Ethereum, and I'm trying to think when this was, maybe in the last couple of weeks or last month here, but it was just about the difference between Satoshi and you have that experience obviously of Ethereum kind of being in that world and seeing that years ago and then transitioning, because the one thing I'm passionate about also is people look at Bitcoin or sometimes there's the toxicity and stuff like that. People just like, okay, you're a genius, right? And this is a talk that we can get into another day, but you get this with Catholicism as well, right? We've talked about this a little bit over time, which again, story for a different day, but you get some of this toxicity or this, high and mighty where people just discard Bitcoiners. And that's we've been through the gauntlet, like we a lot of us did shitcoin or we were mining Ethereum or whatever we were doing. And we came through this gauntlet and learned through experience. And that's when you talked about wisdom earlier and stuff like that. So if you could just touch on maybe, the difference, kind of some of your epiphanies, maybe what transitioning and being in that world from Ethereum and seeing that, and then those aha moments with Bitcoin that really kind of jarred that transition.
Yeah. Well, I think a good starting point is something you just mentioned, which is complexity. That any system, but whatever it is that you're trying to design, that tries to do too much at the same time, highly likely to fail, right? It doesn't work. And, in my career, not every product I tried to develop actually made it to market or was successful, even if it did. And those that tried to do too much were the ones most likely to fail. And software, especially, is really complex. There are so many interdependencies. And I'm sure most of you have probably heard this, but you fix A or you add feature B or whatever it is, and then it works. But you find out when you get in the real world that C and D break or don't perform properly, or people don't interact with it in the way in which you thought they would. That's often the biggest problem with software. Microsoft, we talked about Microsoft and Windows and all that. I mean, the early days, that software was hard to work with because when you didn't interact with it the way that it was expecting you to interact with it, it broke. And so, what I started to see with Ethereum, going back to when started, wow, they're taking on so much work. That was kind of the first thing, like, God, can they really do all this? And the simplicity of Bitcoin being built on layers, being built with a couple very specific missions at the base layer and pushing things up, that's the way successful complex systems that I've interacted with in the past worked. So that was one problem. Second problem was, again, nothing probably earth-shattering for anybody. I started looking at the control mechanism, and it doesn't have the node system and the governance that Bitcoin has. It seems like, I think it's been proven true, that a small number of people can dictate the direction of Ethereum. Now, what people haven't talked about, and I'll relate it back to something we already talked about, which is, let's go back to the 6 nines of reliability. So if you assume that Vitalik and all the lieutenants and cohorts are competent and pure, like they truly are great people and they're extremely competent, they're not going to live for 1,000 years. How many regime changes will there be in 1,000 years? Well, let's say they're each good for 20 years. So that means there's going to be 500 regime changes. Well, in the course of that 500 years, what is the likelihood that they all remain of pure heart and of competence? Pretty freaking low.
Yep.
So, so that really started to bother me. Like that's like, hey, they're building this thing with this dependency. And I don't want to argue with somebody about whether Vitalik's good or not. It doesn't matter, because in the year 2100, Vitalik's not going to be in charge. So who's going to be in charge? What are the rules going to be? And who's going to be authorizing the changes? And nobody knows. But we know in Bitcoin, we know the nodes are going to be there, and we know that the nodes will vote. And we know that we can say with essentially 100% certainty that there will be nodes running versions of Bitcoin Core that are the same as we're running today. And I'm sure at some point, whether it's me or somebody else, somebody will, in their will, put enough money so that a Bitcoin node in its current form will operate forever. Probably several people will do that.
Yeah.
And so nobody else can do that. No other project, coin, whatever you want to call it, can do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing else that can really can or needs to be said there. That was beautiful. Okay, it kind of in wrapping here, last one or two. So Bitcoin trading cards. Let's talk about
Yeah.
this for a second. How did this come about with Aladdin, and why did you guys get involved in the project?
So one of it, as I was kind of getting orange pilled myself, one of the people that I found early on was Adam Meister. And Adam was a very early voice of passion. I would say, if Adam is nothing else, it's passion. And by the way,
Yeah.
simplicity too. We talked about that. Like Adam, Adam has had a message, and he committed himself for a long period of time to preaching that message. And he had a big influence on me. So, um, Adam and I don't know how many years ago it was, but for whatever reason, we connected. Because I found him on his, YouTube channel and his
Mm-hmm.
Twitter, and we started communicating, and I've been on his show. And so he knew my background. And so one day, I guess it was 15 months ago or so, he reached out to me and said, "Hey, will you talk to the Bitcoin trading cards people? I think that they'd benefit from hearing from you." So I connected to Aladdin through Adam. I heard the story, and it resonated with me. I on a couple levels. First, it hit me, the child in me, because I I started collecting cards in about 1970, baseball cards, football
Mm-hmm.
cards. I still have them all, by the way,
Wow.
and it means a lot to me. They were very memorable, and it was a different era of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And like I said, it attached me to baseball and football and basketball, like the sports that I was really into. Those players were like, I'd get a card, I'd get a Willie Mays or Nolan Ryan or something like that. It was
Mm-hmm.
just because by the way, though, in those days, like you got to watch like one baseball game a week on TV.
True.
So, there
Very
was like,
different than now. Yeah.
yeah, there was like on Saturday, there would be like, I think it was NBC game of the week with Joe Garagiola, and whatever
Wow.
it was, if it was, the Cardinals against the Padres, that's what you watched.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I lived outside Chicago, so we did get WGN, so they would broadcast some of the Cubs games, if they came in, because we had the rabbit ears, and
Mm-hmm.
we didn't have cable or anything like
Yep.
that. So, but that was it. And so your attachment to your heroes was just through the box scores in the newspaper and these cards. That was it. And so that there was something about that was, really big to me. And the second thing is that Bitcoin lacks fun. And so after I talked to Aladdin the first time about it, that was my comment to him. Even was I at the time the direction was very education centric, and I told him I appreciated that and I applauded it. But my big feedback to him was, it's not much of a twist to make this really fun, and go back to that like child
Mm.
like thing. And
Yes.
so, getting a Bitcoiner getting a Max Kaiser card should have that. I think there's the possibility of some of that same excitement, coming as an example.
Yes.
And so that was the connection. Like, hey, I think, we need across Bitcoin this things happening at all kinds of different levels. And I sit down here on a day-to-day basis at the base layer, worrying about keeping my team, keeping the servers running, and the base, doing our part to keep the base layer running. Well, Bitcoin trading cards is the whole other end of the Bitcoin system, like ecosystem,
Yeah.
right? And so for me, it was important to at least offer some counsel to Aladdin and the team, and ended up probably getting sucked in a little more than I anticipated at first, but it's fun. Like, it's hard not to. And then I got my wife involved, and
Yeah.
you know, So yeah,
Yeah, sucked in a little bit.
yeah,
That's an understatement for sure. It's so funny. Yeah, it's it can be, you're talking about monetary stuff and the movement that Bitcoin is right now, and it can, it's, we're talking, like you said, we're talking mining or macro, and there's all these different, things, or it can be wonky words or whatever. So having that element of fun, definitely is in one of my buddies who I think you had met, JD, right by the booth there.
yeah. I remember.
He had, yeah, he had said a while ago, Bitcoin needs a halo, like for the kids that were using the gaming, what I think Microsoft owns them now, or did for a long time, but 10, 20 years ago, that Halo video game was massive. And it's funny because that's one of the reasons I joined in as well, right after the Pacific Bitcoin was 10, 12 years ago, thinking, man, there needs to be a Call of Duty for education, just for children, for kids. And here I am with four little ones, and trying, doing much of that same thing now, and kind of fulfilling my dream in a way of what the school system unfortunately is not doing, guys. Let's just say that. So
Yeah.
yeah, boy, we really appreciate having you though, and your wisdom. I'm kind of coming full circle now, and that's kind of why I wanted to end with that, somewhat of just coming full circle, and the wisdom you impart on not only us, but obviously the Bitcoin community. What you share with everyone is just unbelievable. So thank you.
Thank
And
you.
yeah, of course. And in saying that, in wrapping here, what do you look for? It's kind of a broader thing, kind of encapsulating everything we've been kind of talking about. But what do you look for in decision makers? Like as a business person, and running companies, and things you have been doing. What do you look for, or people or companies you're investing in? As I know, we've talked about that a little bit. You invest in companies, you have companies, all this stuff, right? And so, what do you look for? And it could be management, I guess, but what do you look for in leaders, decision makers, and maybe how to make better decisions? But maybe what are some of your tips or some of the things you look for that people can kind of walk away with and make themselves a better person, obviously, and kind of level up?
I think it starts with like authenticity, and you know, people as you I think the older you get, the more someone's authenticity becomes very easy to see. And the world's filled with smart people. The world's filled with really good ideas. It's not filled with authentic people. Um, and there are so many people wearing masks, so many people that want to say what they think you want to hear. Um, and when you run into the people that behave that way, it's really an indication of a lack of transparency, an inability to trust them. Um, and, every time I've gone against that, it seems to have bitten me.
Mm.
I made a lot of mistakes that way, but, people that just like, I'm sure everybody out there, like there's something didn't smell right. And it's not the one, there's obvious ones, right? It's the ones that are just something feels a little off and you can't put your finger on it. Those are the dangerous ones. And, above all else, I think, look for authentic people, and if you align yourself with those people, you'll do well. Um, don't let the shiny thing get in your way, because like I said, there are some marvelous ideas by people with impeccable quote unquote pedigrees. They went to the right school and have worked for the right companies, but they're there for the wrong reason. And they will usually say what you want to hear and not what is real. And that can be a business partner, it can be somebody you're investing in, it can be a supplier. Um, life's too short, the, to to get involved with those kind of people. So, and I do that with, we at my company, what our typical business model is we'll find an energy site. We're doing it right now. Actually, we're actively raising money for a few sites. We've identified places where we have great energy sites. We know how to build sites quickly and inexpensively, and we go seek investors. And I said this to somebody the other day who was a good guy, but he asked me a similar question, which is how do you find your investors? And I said, well, when an investor approaches us, we're not only interviewing, or they're not only interviewing us, but we're interviewing them, because I don't want to be partners with people that are in it for the wrong reason or that are inauthentic. And I'm too old for that. I just had too many problems. So and at the end of the day, like for us, because we're in the Bitcoin world, I think look at people who exhibit and live the Bitcoin ethos. Because again, look at Core Scientific. What you have is a company probably professing to be one of the biggest Bitcoin advocates out there. Certainly one of the most powerful miner in the world. And they were acting outside the ethos of Bitcoin and in an inauthentic way, and kaboom. So,
yeah, no, it's I resonate with that too. I mean, doing real estate for the last 12 years, and it just raising money and investing in stuff. You don't want the headache. So it's like you said, it's not only an interview. It goes both ways. You're trying to see what kind of money are you taking on and who are you partnering with. So it's well said, Bob. Thank you. Awesome. Well, awesome stuff. Thank you for spending time. Where can people find you? I know we talked about Boomer_BTC on Twitter. Where else can people find you? What's the best way?
You can find, I have 2 podcasts. One is a shorter form. I got quite a bit of content lined up called Old Man Yells, as you said, which are usually just me ranting on some topic for 10 to 20 minutes. And then we have a longer form one called Mind Your Business, which are usually, I guess this one ended up being closer to 2 hours.
I know.
But kind of like this, where we pick somebody. It could be a Steve Barber or a Dennis Porter, or have people like that on the show, and we'll go in deep on a topic, with that particular person. So anyway, those are on YouTube and Spotify and Apple and all those sort of platforms. And then barefootmining.com, especially for anybody that's looking for investment into Bitcoin mining. We welcome hearing from you through the website.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Bob. I appreciate the time here today. And like I said, it's almost 2 hours. There's so many things, but we'll have to do some other parts over time here. So thank you so much. I appreciate your time, Bob.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Well, I told you this was going to blow your mind. These past 2 hours have hopefully been as much of a treat for you as they were for me. Taking notes and typing the whole time and just thinking of things. I mean, Bob was dropping so many things that again I'd never even heard of, and they're just outside my purview. And I can't wait to go check those things out. Things like the 10th Man, or World War Z with Brad Pitt. How do I miss a Brad Pitt movie? I mean, come on. That's pretty wild. So these concepts that Bob shares, and again his decades of experience and wisdom that the Bitcoin community as a whole, not to mention humanity itself, but business owners can take and heed his advice. And we're so grateful and so glad that he is an advisor for us in a Bitcoin trading cards company and providing fun. I think that's the thing as well, that monetary movements, as fun as it can be to have your own money and get wealthier over time, you still need to have some fun. And that's what we're trying to do with Bitcoin trading cards. So Bob really nailed that. And also I loved his answer, by the way, about authenticity. How do you find leaders and how do you become a better decision maker? It's authenticity. Be yourself. Be who you are. And I think those are things that I'm going to continue to try to just look inward and how I can be better and be more of who I'm supposed to be, but also imparting that on others and my children as well. I appreciate you. Please let me know your questions, your comments, concerns on this episode. It was every single one gets better and better. I always think, oh, this is the most fun, but then the next one is even more fun somehow, and it just continues to progress. And I appreciate you being here. We look forward to seeing you on the next one.